can go back even to Thomas Aquinas, who actually talks about the third commandment and a sign. In fact, Catechism 2176, they define their sign as Sunday. So we've been anticipating for a very long time people like Stephen Wolfe. In fact, Jonathan Berry right now with Project 2025, bringing together.
Here goes an amazing video that we need to speak about. And the title of this one, Interview with a Christian Nationalist, Sunday Laws, Church and State, and the End Times. His name is Lennox Califongua. The title of this YouTube channel, there's going to be a link in the description below, Heritage and Hope Ministries. Shout out to James Bowen and the team for doing this interview. I thought this was amazing. Great discussion, by the way. So let's go through a number of segments of this video. This video already has 21,000 views. Maybe we can push it to 25 or above. By the way, I just want to say thank you for all of you who's been subscribed and watching our YouTube channel. We hit 70,000 subscribers just a few days ago. So let's shoot for 80,000. Like and subscribe if you enjoy what you are hearing here. And thank you for supporting and praying for us as well. So now let's get right into this video. The first part we're going to speak about is God's law, civil government, and morality. Let's take a listen.
How do you define morality or morals? Where does that come from? Who imposes that? Where kind of talk me through that morality?
Yes. So morality has to do with the idea of the righteous standing of people before God, either individually or culturally. Now, that's what morality deals with. And I think morality is exclusively determined by God and God alone. Okay. He has given us his law, both in our hearts and in writing. And this is a law we ought to adhere to. So God is the architect, the originator of morality as a reflection of who he is, as being a moral God, a God who is upright. So that would be my understanding of morality.
So if morality is exclusively from God, then how can the state enforce that?
This is a really good question. If morality is from God, how can the state install or enact morality, right? And I want to hear his answer because that matters here, because the crux of the conversation has something to do with that, right? How much power does the state have when it comes to the enforcement of morality or God's law? And when this is being enforced, to what degree should there be enforced? Does that mean all God's law, some of God's law, which part of God's law? And how does that go for the people who are unconverted, right? But we do know the law has its value and significance. I'm curious to hear his answer. Let's take a listen.
Yes. So I would say that to kind of even back up a little bit here. So we acknowledge that Christ is king. And I think that's an important thing to underscore first and foremost. Christ is king and he rules over everything, which means his word applies to all things. His word consists of his law, which also ought to apply to all things. And so in our understanding of this, we also then recognize that this is something that ought to be implemented in different corners of life. So I believe that Christ has given us, I'd say, foundationally 4 kinds of governments. Some people say 3, some people say 4. But I would say there's self-governance is a reality. I think familial governance is a reality. I think ecclesial governance is a reality. And state governance is a reality. And to each, they're given their own unique roles. To the self, it's really just the injunction to love God, to be self-controlled, exercise the fruits of the Spirit, to govern oneself well. To the realm of family, God has given the distinct responsibilities of health, education, and welfare. This is the pattern that you see in Scripture. When you see health, education, and welfare being articulated, it is often in the context of family. And that is a real government that God has established. The other government there is the church. And of course, the church has the keys to the kingdom, so to speak. It is the pillar and ground of truth in society. This is where people learn, and people who belong to God come together to understand who God is, what his.
And I think one of the questions that I'm not sure if they're going to ask this question. I saw this a couple of days ago. which church are you talking about here? Because the church is so divided. We should say, which version of Christianity should the government, right, adhere to? And that's the big question, because if you end up listening to Protestants, and in Protestantism, there's all these divisions, and there is the non-denominations, and there are the word of faith movements, right? And we also have Catholicism, right? We have some of that. And so which version of Christianity should Christian nationalists take on and encourage government to install for humanity? That right there is a huge question. Let's keep listening.
His word says, and to then go forth and be salt and light. And so there's a sense in which the church really is the moral consciousness in any given society. That is its distinct role. And I'd say to the state, the state has been charged with the responsibility to preside over justice, which is to punish that which is evil and protect that which is good. And of course, the state doesn't determine what good and evil are. God alone determines those things. And the state ought not to transgress the other realms and distinctions that God has provided. Therefore, the state ought not to preside over education, for example. The state ought not to even sort of dictate how worship should be done. Right? So, for example, the COVID mandates were terrible. That was the state imposing itself in a way that it shouldn't.
Wow, that's interesting. He said this, right? Very thoughtful guy, by the way. I can see the way his brain works, and I'm following the logic, right? But remember what he just said. The state is not supposed to impose how people are supposed to be worshipped. But there's something very interesting that I've learned from a lot of Christian nationalists, right? They really trying to figure out ways to solve the words problem. They really are. They really believe that what they have is the truth. And I will say we can actually unite to a degree when it comes to family, self-governance, and government. When it comes to ecclesiastical governments, we have some serious issues, right? So that's kind of where my position is when it comes to that. But keep in mind, he just said the state is not supposed to enforce worship. Now, they're going to ask a question. They're going to ask a question that has to do with the Sabbath. And I want you to notice what he's about to say.
You would have no problem then with legislating and imposing blue laws, for example.
I think there's a sense in which this has actually been something that's happened for a very long time. So absolutely, I'd say, and of course, I'd have to define what blue laws are here. To get you correct, by referring to blue laws, you're referring to basically Sunday laws, if I'm not mistaken. The idea that there is a day in which we ought to rest and worship God as a holy and distinct day from other days. Am I correct there?
Federally, so you would be in favor of, say, a federal law to close down everything on Sundays in that sense?
I'd say that I am not exactly opposed to that sort of thing. But again, I would say that
I hope you're catching his drift here. He just said the state should not imposing religious laws nor how we worship God. But he is for Sunday blue laws, which is still a religious law, even though not all Sunday blue laws demand for the people of the community to go to church for worship, but the trajectory leads there. Right? We don't say Sunday blue laws, everything about it is bad, but it is still a state legislated type of law that teaches people to do something that normally churches will have to do. That is still an act of worship.
God alone determines those things, and the state ought not to transgress the other realms and distinctions that God has provided. Therefore, the state ought not to preside over education, for example. The state ought not to even sort of dictate how worship should be done.
Our man here just contradicted himself and did not realize it. But nevertheless, let's keep listening because I'm loving the dialogue and the respect that is being shown here.
That there's a way in which all the governments that God gives us ought to recognize that as a law that they ought to apply. So I think heads of households ought to apply that. I think heads of churches ought to apply that. I think the state ought to apply that.
If I may kind of clarify one of your points there.
Yes.
You said that the church holds the keys basically to the kingdom, essentially.
Right. Yes.
And that the church is kind of what lays down. But the thing is that in Protestantism, as I'm sure you're aware, there's, how many thousands of different Protestant, you got Baptists and Presbyterians and, the list goes on and on.
Right.
So who exactly is the church? Again, I go back to definitions, which I think is important, is how do you define who the church is, who gets the say? Because you get into the nitty-gritty of it, and you're going to have disagreements there.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, of course.
Good question.
I think the church, very simply, are people who gather together to affirm the core truths of the Bible. I think one of the creeds that I would refer to most directly would be the Apostles' Creed.
Oh, mercy.
Anyone who can affirm the teachings of the Apostles' Creed, I think, should be regarded as Christian.
Wow. Did you hear that? So the church, and what he's saying here is not far-fetched from what we read from the Great Controversy, right? There is this idea of uniting on our common beliefs, right? Common ground type of connection. Therefore, we shall do the following because we have these orthodox beliefs. And this is not to say everything that's orthodox is bad, but what if we have a belief that is considered unorthodox, right? The rest of the Christian world does not adhere to that belief, right? Like the sanctuary, that's not orthodox. What about our health message? That's not orthodox. What about the 7-day Sabbath? That's also not orthodox. So you see how easy when a number of people with religious views unite under common ground, how easy it is to ostracize and persecute people who don't agree with them. Is that simple of a thing. While he is separating church and state to a degree, but he is still uniting state with God under a religious position, which is still problematic. And again, this is confirming everything we have been speaking about as Seventh-day Adventists. Like, it confirms just about every single position. It shows to me that we are in the right position here. So now I want to fast forward to James Bowen's position. James Bowen is going to give a really good Bible study here. And I love the way he addresses the matter. Let's take a listen.
Speaks of the Sacramentum Unitatis, the Sunday, which is a profound mark. You can find this in the catechisms as well. We've got all the screenshots of it.
We have some of the catechisms from the 1800s and earlier. I mean, we have books here going back hundreds of years that document this history that has been the great controversy between the devil and his angels and Christ and his side. You have good versus evil going back through the Dark Ages. And I completely agree with you that the Pope is the Antichrist power. I completely agree with you, and I believe that is what all true Protestants
I'd like to
should believe.
emphasize it's not a Antichrist power.
No.
It is the biblical Antichrist.
Yes, yes. And so to look at that and say, well, what are they claiming as their mark? If they are the Antichrist power, and we know the Antichrist power causes all men to receive their mark, what do they call their mark then? If we believe they're the Antichrist, what are they saying their mark is? And they say it clearly. They say it's Sunday.
Yeah, in Catechism 2176, they define it. But back in 1888, when we fought these blue laws that Jared, all the rest of them are trying to do, it was Pope Leo XIII. He's the one that wrote Rerum Novarum that called for labor equality and Sunday legislation as a protection of that. That's the very thing that Jonathan Berry and others are trying to go down that road today. Now we have Leo XIV wanting, and specifically naming himself after Leo XIII, wanting to reckon back to those labor equality policies. And it's right on the cusp of Christian nationalism here in the United States, trying to enforce blue laws in particular. And this is, we've been sharing this all over.
Now, the argument that James Bowen is about to make here has to do with the separation of church and state, separations of powers, clearly showing from the Word of God where this is found. And I want you to listen carefully.
The only thing that the state has any outward authority to do or any ability to do is to take a look at outward behavior.
Civil behavior.
Civil behavior. Yeah. They cannot, nobody can read a man's mind. So Christ made it very clear that upon the superscription, whose name it was, when you're talking about matters pertaining to God, When you're talking about things like blue laws, for example, which bear the superscription, the name of God, it's not Caesar's business to legislate those. And I would submit further that if we go to 1 Peter 5:2, there was this principle that even within the church, coercion was not to be something that was administered or involved with ministers. And even further, in 1 Corinthians 5, you see where Paul actually makes a distinction there about judging those in the church. But he washes his hands of those outside of the church. What have I to do to judge them? So any minister that's trying to judge those outside of the church and using the civil authority to do so reckons back to the same principles that Roman Catholicism used in the Middle Ages and the Inquisition. And I might add to that, Jared Longshore's position regarding a test for civil office, specifically by the ecclesiastical ruler for somebody who's supposedly in the church, is actually an argument that the very same principles that Catholicism are built upon by having an ecclesiastical ruler who has the keys of the kingdom, but nobody else. And furthermore, it's a violation of Article 6 of the Constitution in establishing and imposing a religious test for office. So we can see right here that he is appealing to the very same principles that established the Inquisition in joining together church and state. And, in Bible prophecy, we can go to Revelation 17, where we see in Protestants for centuries recognize this woman as a representative of the Roman Church who rode the beast power, thereby uniting church and state. It's even reflected on the Vatican flag, where you have the silver and the gold keys of civil and temporal power that are bound together by a red cord of unity. So to go and appeal to the unification of church and state like that, and to go that direction, is a return to papal principles.
Wow. Whew. This is par for the course. And I'll tell you what, this conversation was great. It is very thoughtful, balanced biblically, and I really appreciate the dialogue. And I also appreciate Lennox's position. He comes there to be schooled by 4 Seventh-day Adventists, and he kept a humble spirit about that. And I think that speaks volume to his position as well as an individual. James Bowen went on to speak some more about this, and I want you to hear what else he says, because I want to end with this video. There's going to be a link in the description below. Check it out. Give them the viewership. This is a good video because it helps us to see what's happening here. Amazing dialogue. 21,000 views. This should be at 100,000 views because of how rich and balanced and thoughtful it was and how respectable the conversation is. It wasn't a debate. It was a dialogue, but they brought the fire. They brought the goods. And I think our man here, when he goes back home, if he's an honest man, I believe that he is. Listening to him, he's actually a very nice guy, very thoughtful. He has to do some rethinking on his position, right? And keep in mind, he actually believes that Roman Catholicism is the Antichrist. He believes that. And it also doesn't agree with the Pope position at all. However, as a Christian nationalist, he is pushing the principles of Roman Catholicism at the heart, even the Sunday law, which he fails to do. Anyway, I want to hear your thoughts. Listen to this final remark coming from James Bowen. This is really good to take a listen to. And also, let's have the conversation in a comment below. I'll be waiting for you. Take a listen.
I have a concern for that is because this book right here, we are printing 1 billion copies, and that's with a B. We had 40,000 of these at the inauguration, Trump's inauguration. We have been anticipating the very objectives that you are seeking to do for a very long time, and we view it as a fulfillment of Bible prophecy. What you are doing is actually something that we've known about. I've known about it since I was a kid. This book right here is a Sacrosancta Concilia from the Jesuit Philippe Labre, and it has the Council of Trent, January 18, 1562, where Catholicism made a declaration, and it's been reflected in catechisms and documents ever since, that it was not upon the authority of Christ, that the day was changed from Saturday to Sunday, but upon ecclesiastical authority. Now Christ said himself that not a jot or tittle would change till all be fulfilled. Behind Alex right there is a document that I got from Oxford. We're in the process of working with universities in Europe, in the United States, to digitize manuscripts. Protestants for hundreds of years recognized that Sunday would be the mark of the beast because there's a false worship, there's a false name, there's a false image, and there's a false mark. And you can go back even to Thomas Aquinas, who actually talks about the third commandment and a sign. In fact, Catechism 2176, they define their sign as Sunday. So we've been anticipating for a very long time people like Stephen Wolfe. In fact, Jonathan Berry right now with Project 2025, bringing together FLSA amendments to get that conversation started. We actually shot it down in 1888.
Are you familiar with the Blair Act that came out in 1888? Because this was actually where they tried to pass a federal Sunday law. They actually tried to impose Sunday rest on a federal level in 1888, and it went before the Senate. So,
Lennox, our people here in Tennessee were in chain gangs at that time period. So when you talk about legislating the first table of the law, our people were arrested and put in jail for that. We expect that to return because of the principles that you do not see coming here in Jared Longshore's position. Our people were arrested. We fought before the United States Labor Committee. And right now, the Labor Committee is considering Jonathan Berry's nomination. And we are mobilizing our people globally right now to protest that, because we do anticipate it to go forward at some point, okay? We're not saying he's the one for sure, but we've anticipated a push like this for a very long time. Protestantism recognized that Sunday was the mark. And I can go back to Thomas Tillam.